Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back. I'm that Canadian brother, Sadat. Today I just wanted to give a quick book recommendation. This is a book that I just finished from the library. It's called Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an by Denise Spellberg. Some of you will already have heard of this book, but I didn't see any Muslim YouTube reviews or recommendations for this book, so I just wanted to quickly plug it. To be honest, I think the book is more important for American Muslims. So while it is relevant to other Muslims in the Western world, but if you're an American Muslim, I think this is especially important for you to read, especially in the times that we live in right now, where the question of whether Muslims even belong in America or not is being raised, and whether Islamic values are somehow incompatible, or let's say completely incompatible with American values. All of these kinds of questions are being raised, and I think this is a great, excellent book for American Muslims to read. In addition to the obvious point that Thomas Jefferson owned an English translation of the Qur'an, that's why this book is called Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an. In addition to that point, some other interesting points that I jotted down, which just to give you kind of an idea or a sampling of what I gained from this book, is firstly, the book reminds us that Muslims have had a presence in America from the very beginning, because remember, there were thousands of African Muslim slaves who were forcibly brought to America, and so they were already there in America, right under the noses of the founding fathers. They were there, but their religion was invisible. However, they were there. In this book, for example, Denise Spellberg mentions that Muslims probably even outnumbered Jews and Catholics at one point in the early history of America. But again, because these were black African slaves, their religious rights or liberties were not respected. Well, they didn't have religious rights and liberties. So in that sense, they were invisible and they weren't really thought of, or they weren't really taken into consideration. But technically, there would have been more Muslims in America than Jews and Catholics at a particular point in history. Another interesting point that I got from this book, it was on page 9, is that Thomas Jefferson, because he was in favor of universal religious liberties, universal religious rights, and he was advocating very strongly for the religious rights of Jews, Catholics, and he used Muslims or Mohammedans as a theoretical example. So in other words, there weren't actually any white free Muslims in America that we know of at the time. But Thomas Jefferson used Muslims as a polemical device, meaning that, look, we should extend religious rights and freedoms even to the Mohammedans, even to the Turks. And so if we extend freedom of religious rights to them, then of course we should also extend universal religious rights to Jews and Catholics as well. And for this reason, in his time, Thomas Jefferson was actually accused by his political opponents of being a Muslim. And I found that very interesting in light of Barack Obama, or Barack Hussein Obama, being accused by many right-wing American conservatives of being Muslim, as if being a Muslim is a crime. But Barack Obama is not the first to suffer from this accusation. So Thomas Jefferson himself had been accused, whether seriously or whether just polemically, he was accused of being a Muslim or a Mohammedan. Another interesting random point that I got from the book on page 76 is the use of the word infidel. So infidel, remember, is a word that comes from the English Christian tradition. And that's something we need to remind our non-Muslim friends of, because oftentimes we're asked, I'm sure Muslims out there, you've been asked perhaps by your friends or people who aren't your friends, that what is this teaching that Islam has about the infidel? Why do you call non-Muslims infidels, or do you have to fight the infidels? And it's important to remind people that infidel is an English word. It comes from the English Christian Protestant tradition. It's not something that Muslims made up. Muslims didn't make up this English word. So even if we were borrowing or co-opting this English word, the deeper question is, where does this word come from? What is its origin? How was it originally used? And Denise Spellberg in this book explains that infidel obviously was used by English-speaking Christians for non-Christians and even for other Christians from other Christian denominations. But what's really interesting is that from the year around 1700 to to perhaps all the way to 1900, when the word infidel was used in England, it almost always meant Muslims. So isn't that interesting that the same word that Muslims are accused of using, that word was actually applied to Muslims. So if in the year 1700 or 1750 or 800 in England, if you were to use the word infidel, oftentimes people assumed that that meant Muslims. That meant the Turks or the Mohammedans. They, the Muslims, were that main group that this term was applied to. That's not to say that Muslims don't have a similar word or have a word that means something like that in Arabic. Yes, we have the word kafir, which means a disbeliever or one who covers up the truth. But that word has its own history and it has its own connotations. To simply take the English word infidel, because remember, infidels were killed. They were burned at the stake. They were torn apart, right? To simply take that English Christian word infidel and superimpose it on Islam, that is not fair. That leads to a lot of problems. So it's worthwhile reminding our Christian and other non-Muslim friends that infidel it's your word. It's not our word. It's your word. It comes from the English Christian tradition, because pretty much every religion has some kind of word that it uses to label and categorize and understand those who don't belong to that faith. That only makes sense. And then one of the things that is discussed in the book is America's relations with the Barbary states. The Barbary states were a coalition of different Muslim states in North Africa that were only nominally under Ottoman rule. And the Barbary states, because they controlled their waters, when American merchant ships would come into their waters, the Barbary state would attack those unauthorized merchant ships and would demand some kind of money or tribute be given to them. But the book points out that this was kind of a way of life at the time. So for example, there were Europeans that were doing this. There were European pirates and things that were doing this. But in European history, those European pirates are referred to as corsairs. Corsairs, which is just a euphemism for pirates. So when Muslims do it, they're pirates. When non-Muslims do it, when we do it, then they're corsairs. So that was a really interesting point. Some Americans today will say, well, you know, America was actually formed in response to a Muslim threat, in response to the Muslim threat of the Barbary states. And that's why, in fact, the US Navy was first made. It was to counter that threat from the Muslim. And while that is to a large part true, what is often overlooked is that this was not a simple case of Muslims versus non-Muslims, Muslims versus the kuffar, or Muslims fighting the infidels. History is not black and white like that. So for example, Britain, which you remember the United States had just recently separated from, Britain was actually encouraging those North African Muslim states to do these attacks on the American merchant ships. So it's extremely rare in history that you have just Muslims just fighting for the cause of Islam, fighting non-Muslims simply because those people are non-Muslims. History is much more vast and history is much more nuanced than that. And a couple of other interesting points that are often overlooked, which Spellberg makes in this book, is that this North African piracy against American merchant ships started as a desperate measure to repulse a Spanish invasion of Muslim territory. Because remember, the Moors had been booted out a couple of 300 years prior to this from Spain. And now Spain was actually the threat to these North African Muslim states. So these North African Muslim states were also raiding European merchant ships as a measure to try to defend themselves and to keep their waters free of European threats. And finally, when Americans complained that these North African Barbary states were taking American white slaves and they were taking white European Christian slaves, this complaint rings very hollow when you consider the fact that these same Americans who were fighting the Barbary states, there were hundreds of thousands of enslaved African slaves right under their very noses. And so while they objected to white people being taken as slaves, the hundreds of thousands of African slaves that they owned on their farms, on their plantations, that's not something that they were morally opposed to at the time. So Spellberg makes a very good case of pointing out some of these things in this book. And she also mentions that despite the fact that Thomas Jefferson and some other founding fathers like him who were laying the theoretical groundwork for the tolerance of potential future American Muslim citizens, they were at the same time impervious or blind to the fact that there were already African American Muslims right there under their own noses. So again, it's an excellent book. I would recommend it for anyone to read, but especially if you are a Muslim in America, this is an absolute must read. Make sure that you read it, and please put your comments below. Take care.